every country on Earth owes money? The United States alone carries over $38 trillion in debt, the highest figure in its history. Europe, Japan, and even oil-rich nations like Saudi Arabia are deep in the same hole. But here's the real question. If everyone owes money, then who is everyone actually paying? Welcome to History of Finance, where money, power, and the past collide. Today, we're exploring how debt became the invisible engine that drives the modern world. Debt isn't just a burden. It's the architecture beneath everything, every boom, every crash, every war, and every empire. To understand how we arrived at a planet drowning in over $300 trillion of debt, nearly 3 times the size of the global economy, we have to go back to where it all began. Long before credit cards or digital banking, the idea of national debt was born in war. In 1694, England was fighting France and running out of gold. Desperate, the king turned to wealthy merchants and asked them to lend him money. In return, he promised regular interest payments backed by future taxes. That promise could be bought, sold, and traded, and to manage it, the Bank of England was created. This was revolutionary. For the first time in history, a government could spend money it didn't yet have, simply by borrowing from its own future. And those who lent to the crown received something priceless in return, a guaranteed promise from the state. That was the birth of the government bond, the seed of the modern financial system. Soon, France copied the idea. The Netherlands perfected it. And later, the newly independent United States used it to finance its own revolution and expansion. Debt became a symbol of credibility, a tool of power rather than weakness. Empires once conquered land to extract gold. Now they issued bonds to extract interest. The battlefield had moved from soil to spreadsheets. 3 centuries later, debt has become the world's dominant export. The United States owes more than $38 trillion. Japan owes over $9 trillion. And global borrowing rises by nearly $1 trillion every 100 days. Every nation owes, every bank lends, and every citizen, through taxes, savings, and pensions, is both debtor and creditor at once. So, who actually holds the other end of the rope? Let's start with the United States because its debt isn't just national, it's global. Roughly half of it is publicly held, meaning it's owed to investors rather than to other parts of the government. About 2/3 of those investors are American banks, pension funds, mutual funds, insurance companies, and the Federal Reserve itself. The remaining third sits in foreign hands, mostly Japan, China, and a handful of European countries. So when people say America is in debt to China, that's true, but only for a small portion of the total. Most of America's debt is actually owed to itself. The Treasury issues bonds. Banks and funds buy them. The Federal Reserve sometimes buys them back, creating new dollars in the process. Taxes then fund the interest payments on those bonds, which flow back into American retirement accounts. It's a circular mirror. The debt is real, but the creditor is mostly a reflection of the same system. And that same circular logic now extends across the planet. Japan lends to the U.S. through Treasury bonds. The U.S. lends to Europe through the IMF. Europe lends to developing nations through the World Bank. And developing nations lend back to rich economies by parking their reserves in Western bonds. It's a global web of promises, a kind of financial hot potato where the potato is made of debt. Every promise is secured by another promise. It's like a poker table where every player has borrowed chips from the next. And the only rule keeping the game alive is that no one stands up. But behind that poker table sits another layer of power, the markets. Hedge funds, pension funds, sovereign wealth funds, and central banks manage tens of trillions in assets. They decide who gets to borrow cheaply and who must pay a premium for survival. When markets lose confidence, currencies collapse, governments fall, and entire economies can be restructured overnight. Democracy might decide who governs, but markets decide who survives. And the high priests of this system are the central banks. They don't just manage debt, they manufacture it. Every time the Federal Reserve or European Central Bank buys government bonds, it creates new money in exchange. The liability on one balance sheet becomes the asset of another. Every dollar, euro, or yen in circulation represents a unit of debt somewhere else. There is no such thing as debt-free money. Every coin, every bill, every digital transaction has an IOU engraved invisibly on its surface. For decades, this loop has worked because people believed it would. So long as investors believe that governments will pay interest, even if they never pay back the principal, the machine keeps running. But what happens when confidence cracks? We've already seen it. In Greece, in 2010, the government's debt became too large to manage. Bondholders panicked. Yields spiked. The European Central Bank and IMF stepped in with a rescue, but at a heavy cost. Austerity, tax hikes, job losses, and a lost decade for millions. In Argentina, repeated defaults turned national debt into a generational curse. In Sri Lanka, a currency collapse and fuel shortages followed when the government couldn't repay its loans. When the system breaks, the invisible creditors suddenly have faces: institutions, rating agencies, and anonymous bondholders who hold entire nations by the throat. And yet, even after collapse, the same pattern repeats. New loans replace old ones. Old debts are renamed, restructured, and recycled. Because in the modern world, debt isn't designed to be paid off. It's designed to be rolled over. Governments today don't actually plan to repay their debt. Not now, not ever. They refinance it endlessly, issuing new bonds to pay off the old ones. Economists call this refinancing. The interest, not the repayment, becomes the real product. It's the rent charged for global stability. The entire financial system depends on that rent. Like a shark that must keep swimming to breathe, the world economy must keep borrowing to stay alive. If the United States were to suddenly pay off its debt, it would collapse the global financial system overnight. Banks and funds would lose their safest assets. The dollar supply would shrink. Deflation would hit. Markets would freeze, and the global economy would grind to a halt. So instead of paying it off, governments keep issuing more, not recklessly, but rhythmically. Debt has become the heartbeat of capitalism. Each new bond pulse keeps money flowing through pensions, mortgages, and markets around the world. When politicians talk about balancing the budget or paying off the national debt, they're selling a myth. The goal isn't to eliminate debt, it's to sustain belief in it. Because when confidence fades, numbers stop mattering. Interest rates surge, currencies break, and economies unravel. That's the hidden truth of sovereign debt. The plan was never to pay it back. The plan is to keep the world believing it will. It's a closed loop of trust, fragile but powerful. And as long as that trust holds, the numbers can stretch infinitely, but trust is never shared equally. When we say the world owes money to itself, that's only half true. Interest doesn't flow evenly. It flows upward from workers and taxpayers to the investors and institutions that hold the debt. Debt isn't just a transfer between nations. It's a transfer between classes. The system rewards those who own debt and punishes those who pay it. That's why global inequality and global indebtedness rise together. It's not a conspiracy, it's the design. Creditors aren't villains. Debtors aren't victims. They're two sides of the same machine. But what happens when that machine runs out of fuel? When new borrowing can't keep up with old promises, the illusion shatters. The question, who's the creditor, stops being theoretical and becomes deeply personal. Because at the top of this global pyramid, there's no single villain. It's not China, it's not Wall Street, it's all of them. And it's us. The modern financial system has turned debt itself into money. Governments issue it. Banks multiply it, investors trade it, and citizens depend on it. Debt once meant bondage. Today it means balance. But if that balance ever tips, if confidence breaks, we all remember what debt really is. A promise that can't be kept forever. If this gave you a new way to see the world, hit subscribe, because history doesn't just explain the past. It reveals the system we live in and how fragile it really is.